Hey there, this is Hunter McDermott with AnyoneCanPlayGuitar.org with Music Theory for Guitar Basics. This is Lesson 4. Today we'll be talking about basic triads. So a triad is a fancy name for a three-note chord. So what we're going to start doing is we're taking the notes from our major scales that we learned about in Lesson 2 and 3, and we're going to start taking those notes and kind of cramming them together in different combinations, and we get different types of chords. So some chords that you already know, we're going to learn a little bit about why they are called what they're called, and a little bit more about what's involved in each chord. So what we need to start with is a rundown of three very basic triads, the ones that are found in our major scale. So we have the major chord, the minor chord, and something called the diminished chord. Now diminished chords are very interesting sounding. They kind of give us a little bit of a dissonant quality, which is very good for creating tension, and which then wants to be released, and that creates all kinds of musical interest, makes songs interesting to listen to instead of just sort of bland and boring. However, they are not used all that often in pop music. It's always exciting when they are, but you just don't hear them all that often, at least not in my experience. But major and minor chords, I'm sure you already know a slew of those, a handful of maybe. So here's where they come from. First of all, we're going to start with the scale. So let's start with the G scale, since that's a very guitar-friendly key, and you probably already know a bunch of chords in that key anyway. So we took our chromatic scale at the very beginning, lesson 1, which is all 12 notes, and we say, okay, we don't want all 12 of these, we want just a group that sounds good together. And so we're going to start with G. So we went through G, and we went through that major scale formula, so whole, step, half, whole, half, starting with a G note, and this is what we end up with, G major. So we have G, A, B, C, D, E, and then there's one sharp, there's that F sharp, and then it ends with G again, so G is both one on either end. Alright, so to get a chord from this scale, we just look over here and we decide what kind of chord we want. Alright, I want a major chord. I need to figure out what notes are in a G major chord, or what notes I'm going to need to make that chord. So this says 1, 3, and 5. So one of the other things we did when we talked about major scales is we gave each one of those notes a scale degree, basically a numerical position within that scale. And this is exactly why, because we need to start plucking individual notes out of the scale, and it's pretty handy to know, to give it a name, a position number. Alright, so 1, 3, 5, that means we need to take a G note, and then we're going to skip over A, because that's 2, and we're going to take a B, because that's number 3, then we're going to skip over C, and we're going to take D. So if I take a G, B, and D, I take those three notes, and I put them all together, and I play them, I get a G chord, G major. And so let's look at the common G major chord that you probably play on the guitar, and let's kind of break it down. So here is what most first G chords look like, something like this. So we have our second finger here on the 3rd fret of the 6th string. So this is a way to kind of use the stuff we learned in the first lesson again. So we have our 3rd fret of our 1st string, our 6th string. Now our 6th string is tuned to E, and we learned in the first lesson how to count up 1 half step for each fret to figure out what note we're playing. So here we have E, 1st fret would be F, then F sharp, then G. So our 3rd fret is a G note. That's great. It's perfect. We need a G note for our G chord, and there it is. And better yet, it's on the bottom, which means it's the lowest of all the pitches. Everything else that we play is going to be a higher pitch, which means it's going to have a very nice full round sound. It's going to be easy to identify as a G chord instead of something else. Alright, now the next note we have is our first finger is usually found on the 2nd fret of the 5th string. Alright, so string 5 is tuned to A. So we have A, then the 1st fret of A would be A sharp or B flat, and then the 2nd fret would be B. So there we have G and B. So we're off to a great start. We have both the notes that we need, 2 of the 3 notes that we need for a G chord. Alright, then we have 3 open strings right in a row. So string number 4 is D. Cool, that's already one of the ones we need. Then we have another G, then then we have another B, and then the third fret of the high E string is also going to be G. It's the same as our low one. It's just what we call a higher octave. Now that's also something we can look at right now. An octave comes from the fact that if I start with G and I go through 7 different notes and then I end up back at G, G's like the 8th note. We could consider G to be 1 and then G again to be 8. And of course the prefix that means 8 is oct, so that's where we get the term octave. So if I talk about an octave, I'm talking about playing the same note all the way up here in a different register. So there's a low G and then a medium G and a high G, however many G's or any other note that you want to go. Alright, so we can see that in that application of that G chord that most people learn pretty early on when they start playing guitar, we have all the notes that we need. We have a G, a B, and a D. And importantly, the G, one of the G notes that we found was on the bottom. It was the lowest pitch in the chord, otherwise known as the root of the chord. So everything sprouts out of where that root is. So if I change that root to some other note, then we're not technically playing a G chord anymore. We've got some kind of other funky thing going on. Okay, so that's how we would do a G major chord. Alright, but say we want to play a G minor chord. So the formula for getting a minor chord is to take 1, 3, and 5, just like we did for major, except we're going to flat the third. So that means that instead of B, we now have B flat. Changes everything, makes the chord sound totally different. Alright, so here is a G minor that you might learn pretty early on, I don't know. And this has got our bar here on the 3rd fret, and then our 3rd finger on the 5th string here, on the 5th string 5th fret, and then our pinky on the 4th string 5th fret. That's one of many ways to play G minor. So we hear G major, kind of has sort of a happy, upbeat sound, and then G minor has sort of a not so happy sound. And that's an important thing to think about when you're learning these chords, is how the type of chord sort of has an emotional quality to it. I think that's a good thing to think about and consider when you're listening to music and then playing it and then eventually maybe writing some of your own. Is to think about how the chords that you choose and the notes that you choose have an emotional impact. So if you hear a very happy song in a movie, a very triumphant moment in a movie, chances are it's going to have some major chords in it that are highlighted heavily to make it sound nice and upbeat and happy. Whereas a sort of more somber, reflective, sad scene in a movie or game or whatever is going to maybe have some minor tones to it to kind of give it that minor sound. And then of course it's always fun to try to mix and match. Like you take a band like Radiohead does a lot of really cool things where they have major sounding music, but then the lyrics are kind of dark and sad, and it's a cool juxtaposition of these happy sounds with sad themes. So I think it's always good to think about that when you're learning music and playing it, is to think about what kind of emotional impact you can have on your listener by choosing the notes or chords that you choose. Alright, so the third type of chord we're going to look at is the diminished chord. So we do exactly the same thing. We take 1, 3, and 5. That's basically the definition of a triad. We're taking the 1st, 3rd, and 5th notes of a scale. But we are going to flat the 3rd, like we already did over here, and we're going to flat the 5th. So that would give us G, B flat, and D flat. G, B, and D flat. Alright, so a G diminished chord might look something like this, way up here on top of the neck, or high up on the neck. And it's got that really kind of dissonant, complex sound there. That's great for creating tension, like I was saying earlier, and which gives you something to resolve, and it's very, very interesting chord there. But not all that common. So there you go. In your major scale, coming from our major scale, we can see all these three different types of chords that are very prevalent in music. And in the next and final lesson, we're going to talk about something called a chord scale. So it's going to involve all kinds of different chords being mixed together and how they're all related. And we're going to see those three chords show up. So there you go. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them for me. And stay tuned for the final video in this short little series. Thanks again for watching.